Sadly, this is our last night in this configuration.
No!
Oh, I know. I'm really attached to you guys. It's been a really great group, and we will be doing part 2 of this in September sometime, but we don't have the dates, except it will be the same time slot. So if you do want to know about our things, make sure to sign up on our subscription list. And also, we're doing, there's a group in Bend called Community Conversations of Bend, and they are coming up on June 7th to talk about how to have conversations with people that we're having trouble having conversations with. So there's a flyer here for that. And,
At the Medford Library.
At the Medford Library on June 7th in the evening. And then we also want to give a heads up. We don't have any material right now, but we will be doing a film night with RVML, a 6-week series. It's going to be at Hidden Springs, and it's on Thursday nights, and the first night is July 11th. And our working title is something like Exploring Being Human Through Film. And we'll take different topics like exploring consciousness and exploring love and exploring guilt and exploring, we haven't figured out all the lists, but we will soon. So as long as you're connected to us or the library on our emailing list, you'll get the heads up. But we're going to have to figure it out right here, like within a week. But it would be really fun, and you don't have to come to all of their standalone, but they'll make also a great series. Okay, that's all my PSA stuff.
By donation.
By donation, yes. Go ahead.
We're going to talk about how the Republican Democrat win.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, just while we wait a minute. Well, it was really interesting because it was mostly conservatives, which was really interesting. And I talked later to Gabe, I don't know if you saw the email, that the Democratic Club, they were in it in spirit, but they just couldn't, there were too much going on for them. But in a way it was good because I felt like they talked more freely about how hard it is to be a conservative on campus here and how some of the things that the teachers say to them is very shocking. I was quite chilled, especially the next morning when it hit me. And so I think they spoke more freely and like saying things like sometimes when they know the teacher's liberal, they don't write their papers, they don't write what they really think. And the teachers have said some terrible things to them. So it really, it was very shocking. Like, you know, if you're not a liberal now, you will be by the time you get done with my class. And another time it's a lot of this going on campus.
There's a lot of activism on campuses now, I think.
I'd just like to add a comment to that. And that is when I was in school a lot of years ago, a French major, I had to give a different evaluation of the same story by Prosper Mérimée, depending on whether it was in my short story class or my, like the 20th century or whatever century it was, or some other class, depending on the professor's interpretation of the story. So this is different because it's about politics. Nevertheless, that kind of attitude in the university isn't totally new, unfortunately.
Yeah. So anyway, it was the talk itself. You can find it on bridging.live, and it says what's it called?
Free speech.
Free speech on campus. But it doesn't. We didn't film the discussion because we didn't want anybody to be inhibited. But it was really. I knew some of the stuff, but it was super eye-opening to hear them, and that they have to keep a kind of low profile.
Well, a big problem nowadays is the bias response teams on campuses now, where they encourage students to report bias incidents.
Oh, good.
And on the surface, certainly, it's like, well, that's good. But one of the students, being biased can mean stating a point of view, which is one of the things that we looked at in the free speech talk. Saying a point of view, for example, if you are a pro-life person, there are things that you can say to someone that will be construed as being hate speech. And they get reported. This one fellow has been reported 5 times. And he's a delightful young man.
Well, and then I said, so is that bias only from the bias against the left? Is it, or can people on the right complain about bias against them? And they said not so much. You know, like they didn't report those teachers. So it's the more I get into it, the more shocked I am. But
that's right. You know, again, when you go to our other talks, a big focus that we have is this idea of viewpoint diversity. And whenever you get a group of people, whether they're on the right or the left, well, look at what's happening with the abortion laws in Alabama. You get a lot of people who are really like-minded. They tend to get more extreme. Similarly, you get the blue states. You get a bunch of progressives together. They get a little extreme. And the key, we would say, is we've got to bring those conversations together so that we benefit from both. Doesn't mean changing your base instincts about things, but getting that conversation going is really important.
But you might change your base instinct. I've changed my base instinct.
And that's, again, to plug this event, this How Do We Listen and Understand, this is really geared towards, how do you sit with your, let's say you are a progressive person and you've got the uncle who loves Sean Hannity kind of a thing. How do you engage that person in a way that's thoughtful so that you can have a kind of a dialogue opening up? That's kind of what their focus is, which is really good. But our focus is on critical thinking. This is our last night. This is our last chance to kind of shoot at you what we think about critical thinking.
No, we're scouts. We're not soldiers.
Yeah. And I should say, we are talking about 4 weeks is a little, is not a lot of time to go through critical thinking. And there's so many things on a practical level that we really need to get to. So we are planning on doing a second part to this where we'll get into some of the more practical elements. But we kind of wanted to get a broad overview. And we're going to finish that up tonight by really honing in on this question, how do we navigate our post-truth world? And I'm going to open that up a little bit tonight. And I'm going to kind of make an argument. I'm going to make a case for how we do that in my bit. And Marla will come in behind me. I'm going to start tonight, and I'm going to talk for a long time, a little bit here. So I want to warn you. I want to warn you that I'm going to talk for a long time, but
it'll be fascinating.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how fascinating it really is. And the key idea, I'm going to be drawing inspiration from Steve Pinker's new book, Enlightenment Now. Anybody who knows Steven Pinker? He's one of our most notable intellects. He's a cognitive psychologist. He's written some fabulous books, including The Blank Slate, which we've plugged, and How the Mind Works, which was a runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize. He's a brilliant guy. But he is making the case for reason, science, humanism, and progress, and he's trying to answer this question, kind of how do we navigate this post-truth world? So we'll open that up a little bit. And his basic idea, I've encapsulated in this idea of re-enlight. It's the idea that we need to recommit to the Enlightenment formula that we get knowledge by using facts to reason and persuade ourselves and others. That we really have to get back to a sense of pursuing facts. And of course, we're going to open that up. But that facts are really important. Science is really important. Having that kind of a mindset is really important in the light of some of the things that we now see around us today. And for those of you who don't know, this, of course, is rooted in the Enlightenment. Pinker's, the idea of the Enlightenment kind of undergirds all of this. And for those of you who don't know, the Enlightenment was this period that we often call the Age of Reason, which kind of began in the middle of the 1600s and ended kind of really in the beginning of the 1800s. And what's key about the Enlightenment was a period where it celebrated the power of reasoning to find facts. It developed modern science. It promoted religious toleration. Of course, prior to the Enlightenment, the Europe was overrun with a lot of religious war and conflict and what have you. And I think maybe most importantly, the Enlightenment is responsible for creating governments based in freedom with markets for free trade. The United States is kind of the quintessential Enlightenment idea come to roost in government. Our nation is an enlightenment inspired institution, you could say. And these are some of the leading lights of the Enlightenment. There's John Locke, who inspired Thomas Jefferson, writing the Declaration of Independence, and people like David Hume, Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations and what have you. So this is what we mean by the Enlightenment. And Pinker is saying we need to go back and kind of revisit some of those ideas in light of what we've learned now about, well, some of the mistakes that we've made, to reinvigorate the same kind of pursuit that was the hallmark of the Enlightenment. And that pursuit was all about think for yourself. Think with others, and dare to understand. That was the cry of the Enlightenment. Dare to understand the world. And that drove scientific investigation, which kind of gave us all this. Gave us the iPhone, ultimately, was the role of science in that whole process. And I would say this is kind of central. If you're going to have a crash course in critical thinking, this is kind of the goal, in one sense, is to get to these basic ideas. So that's what we're going to open up. I'm going to open up tonight in the bit that I call Re-Enlight, Navigating Our Post-Truth World. And then we'll take a break. I'll try not to talk too long. And then Marla's going to come and talk about #Republic. How do we navigate our online world? We kind of want to leave with some real practical advice for how to sort through all the stuff that's coming at us online and what have you. So that's what we're going to do. Re-Enlight, navigating our post-truth world. And I'm going to open up 3 basic sections over the next probably about 40 minutes or so. I'm going to try and finish by 8 o'clock, and then we'll have a long break. I'm going to talk about post-truth, going to define it a little bit. And then we're going to look at ideas versus facts, a really important distinction for critical thinking. And then we'll finish touching on the scientific method. We'll look a little bit about how we do science. And I should say, our part 2 of the course, we're going to focus very much in detail on how we actually do the science. So tonight will be a little bit broader in an introduction, and then later we'll go back and we'll kind of look at it in detail. But first, post-truth. If you were at our introduction that we did, we read from Yuval Noah Harari's new book, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He's the author of Sapiens. Maybe some of you have read Sapiens. If you haven't, it's a fabulous book, I think. But he says we're in this age of bewilderment. We're at a time when the old stories have collapsed and no new story has emerged so far to replace them. It's this idea of post-truth. What do we mean by post-truth? Well, this was a word that was coined shortly after the 2016 election. I think the Oxford Dictionary made it its word of the year going into 2017, and probably with good reason, knowing the 2016 election. They defined post-truth as a time when objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. It's kind of where we are today. We're kind of in this post-truth world where objective facts seem to have fallen by the wayside. Even figuring out what those facts might be has fallen by the wayside. It's a period when bullshit, truthiness, and fake news manipulate the masses. I'm going to open that up just a little bit. To begin with, bullshit. Big part of post-truth world is the prevalence of bullshit. Well, what is bullshit? Speech intended to persuade without regard for truth. And of course, the ultimate bullshitters are advertisers, and we've talked a little bit about that. But we live in an age where bullshit, it seems to be rampant. And interesting, there's a fabulous book called On Bullshit by Harry Frankfurt. Anybody read Harry Frankfurt's book? It's a short little book. You can actually read it probably in one setting. Very, very, very insightful book. I think he teaches philosophy at Princeton, or did teach philosophy at Princeton. And he makes an important distinction between, bullshit and lies. What's the difference between somebody who's bullshitting you and somebody who's lying to you? And he says the liar cares about the truth and attempts to hide it. The bullshitter doesn't care if what they say is true or false, but rather only cares whether or not their listener is persuaded. So bullshit has a corrosive kind of effect if you're trying to pursue truth. If you're trying to live in a fact-based kind of world, bullshit is a really corrosive thing. It's the idea that somebody will say just about anything to get you to buy what they're selling or vote for them or what have you. So it's the distinction between bullshit versus lies. And of course, we've had bullshit for a long time. It's just kind of now been codified, you could say, in our post-truth world. But another aspect of post-truth is this idea of truthiness. Who's heard the term truthiness? Well, I think this was Oxford's Word of the Year back in like 2006 or so. And Stephen Colbert, when he wasn't doing his late night show, but when he was on Comedy Central, he kind of coined this, or his writers did, truthiness. Well, what is truthiness? Well, it's the quality of seeming or being felt to be true, even if not in fact true. Oh, I know that's not really true, but it just feels true to me. It resonates with me. I don't have any reasons. I may not have any facts, but that just feels really true. It's truthy. It has a sense of truthiness. And there's a lot of this out there in the culture. There's a lot of emotionally based reasoning as opposed to critically based reasoning. And you see that with this idea of truthiness. And we should expect that because, again, humans are feeling machines that think, as we saw in our first class. Advertisers know this. This is why ads appeal to our feelings, not our thinking so much. It's very subjective. So the culture around us is kind of reinforcing truthiness all the time. As long as you feel a certain way, you know, that's true for you, this kind of thing. But you can see, again, that's very corrosive in terms of trying to figure out what's really true. And it contributes to this kind of post-truth environment that we feel that we're in these days. A great book from the 1980s. Anybody read Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death? A really widely hailed book in the 1980s. He basically writes that he talks about the escape from reason through entertainment culture. And remember, in the 1980s, we were seeing the emergence of cable television and videos where people didn't have to go out to the movies and what have you. People could watch movies. People could consume massive amounts of entertainment. And Postman's whole point is that public discourse has been corroded. In particular, are shifting away from reading, are shifting away from being literary and thinking and being critical and analogy to just kind of being passive, passive people pulling in entertainment from screens and what have you. He writes in his book, again, this is from the 1980s, Americans no longer talk to each other. They entertain each other. They do not exchange ideas, they exchange images. This is the 1980s, mind you.
But
this
way
is
before Instagram.
This is before Instagram and social media. He said, they do not argue with propositions. They don't make arguments. They don't reason so much. They argue with good looks, celebrities, and commercials. It's all very emotionally oriented. He talks about how the role of television in particular has really undermined our ability to think. Because if you're just receiving images, you can do that with all those older parts of the brain. You don't have to use your critical thinking faculties. You can just kind of absorb it all, and everything eventually will just kind of feel kind of truthy or not, what have you. And, one of the things he says in his book, he says, we have all these dystopian ideas from Orwell and Huxley about, what's going to happen with dystopian kind of societies with centralized government and what have you. He says, well, actually, entertainment culture may do the work for us. Entertainment culture may so corrode our ability to think that it'll be easy for people to take our thinking captive. Now, this is before social media. So he was very prophetic in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, kind of presaging or prescient about what was to come. And of course, fake news, the third part of kind of what's contributing to our post-truth culture. fake news, the deliberate creation of a false factual narrative intent on misleading people. It's this idea of disinformation. I grew up, my dad was with NSA, the National Security Agency, and he was a Russian linguist. And he would tell you that the Russians in particular were very, very good at this in the 1950s and 60s. Of course, we were good at it as well in return. But we all know that the Russians did a pretty good job trying to disinform the American people with disinformation during the 2016 election cycle. We have this phenomena of fake news, I think, that we're very, very familiar with now. And there's a sense in which it's kind of been with us for a long time. But now we have the means to really do some damage because of the extensiveness of the internet and the internet culture. This is Alex Jones, for those of you who don't know. He was just banned by Facebook for his disinformation that he publishes online. And of course, to some people, we talked about media bias last night. To some extent, you could say, and people argue that media bias can be such that it has the effect of being fake news. Some of our media outlets on the extreme sides, the effect of what they're reporting is often called out as fake news because they're not giving you the whole truth. They're giving you bits. And there's a sense in which that can be a kind of disinformation. So you'll hear people say all the time, well, that's fake news. Well, it's not really technically fake news. It's not deliberate disinformation. But it has the same kind of effect, because it's giving you a very, a narrow, selected slice of the world.
Isn't that the viewer's responsibility? I mean, I think it's okay in terms of freedom of the press to say whatever you believe. You might be biased, but I would think a viewer would understand that and seek maybe the other side or a different source.
Absolutely, and we did a talk, a bit longer talk on media bias and fake news. How do we get the politics out of journalism? And that was the bottom line point that we made. It's our responsibility to be critical thinkers, to know about, and that's what I was trying to do last week when we put the little chart up, is be aware that these outlets tend to lean in one direction or other, so that you can be thinking when you're taking things in. If I'm reading the Wall Street Journal all the time, for example, which leans right, I want to make sure that I'm also paying attention to maybe the Washington Post, which tends to lean a little bit left, so that you're aware, that these kind of biases are there. So yeah, that's a really good point. But I want to come back to this idea. I want to come back to Harry Frankfurt, because this is something Marla sent me. An interesting quote from Brene Brown's book, Braving the Wilderness, where she quotes Harry Frankfurt, kind of getting to this problem of post-truth, this problem of bullshit and what have you, that kind of inflicts us today. And Brene Brown writes about Harry Frankfurt. She says, Harry Frankfurt argues that the contemporary spread of bullshit also has a deeper source. Our being skeptical and denying that we can ever know the truth of how things truly are. There's a kind of skepticism that's crept into the culture that we can't really know what's true. She goes on to say, he argues that when we give up on believing that there are actual truths that can be known and shared observable knowledge, we give up on the notion of objective inquiry. We can't do any kind of objective inquiry at all. It's like we just collectively shrug our shoulders and say, whatever, it's too hard to get to the truth. So if I say it's true, that's good enough. He argues that once we decide that, it makes no sense to try to be true to the facts. We simply resort to being true to ourselves. And this, to some degree, I would say, is kind of the state of our culture today in many ways. People have given up on the notion that we can know what's true. And there's something underneath this kind of skepticism that's driving this way of thinking. And it's something we would call postmodern skepticism. Who knows, familiar with the term postmodernism? Postmodern skepticism. Something really important because it kind of lays the foundation for our post-truth orientation today. Well, postmodernism, I mentioned the Enlightenment at the outset. The Enlightenment really launched science as we have it today. It focused on reason and what have you. Postmodernism was a reaction to that. The Enlightenment gave us the modern world. It gave us modern institutions and what have you. But postmodernism was, well, technically, it's after the modern. It was a reaction to the Enlightenment. It was, you could say, it's the anti-Enlightenment. And in particular, it was a reaction to some of the excesses of the Enlightenment, some of the things that went wrong with science. Think about things that science has given us that maybe didn't turn out so well. Some people would say things like nuclear bombs, for example, scientific racism, some of the things that the colonial countries did in Africa and in Asia. These were all driven to a large extent by Enlightenment science. And there was a reaction to that in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. In particular, World War I. World War I was one of the most destructive eras in recent human history. And we think about World War II, what the Nazis did. Here, a nation brilliant, with very high IQ throughout the nation, and yet did a lot of damage. And so a lot of folks said, well, wait a second, this was all kind of this also was the product of the Enlightenment. So there was a reaction, a counter-revolution, you could say, to the Enlightenment. Postmodernism, which is characterized by skepticism, absolute kind of skepticism. We can't really know what's true at all. Subjectivism, all that really matters is what I think, what I feel. And relativism. Truth is relative. There's no absolute truth out there. It's relative to who you are, where you are, your situation in life. And in particular, it was marked by a suspicion of reason. And you still have a lot of this in our universities today, because our universities today have a lot of postmodern kind of thinking in the mix, very much so. And, and critically, another marker of postmodernism is what I write is an acute sensitivity to the role and use of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. The Enlightenment gave us a tradition of deliberative democracy, that people argue, they make arguments, they use facts to try and convince one another. Postmodernism says it's not about facts, it's not about arguments, it's about power. And whoever has the most power is what's critical. So you'll get a lot of political movements that are driven by ideas as opposed to facts and evidence and more reasoning. So this is kind of the postmodern ethos, which again drives this post-truth culture. Pushing back on facts. It's one of the reasons why we have this problem today of we can't disagree on the facts. A lot of people don't believe that we can't ever really know what is true and what is really factual. And postmodernism drives that kind of thinking. And the way I've put it is that postmodernism put a check on the excesses of our reasoning. We can become very proud and we can become very kind of haughty and what have you about reasoning. And there's room to criticize the Enlightenment. There's room to criticize the culture of the Enlightenment didn't get everything right. There needed to be some disconfirmation in order to make changes. And that's why that's one of the main reasons why we're in this kind of age of bewilderness. When the old stories have collapsed and no new story has emerged so far to replace it. There's a sense in which culturally we're kind of lost. We don't have this kind of narrative about who we are as Americans so much. We're kind of lost and going in all kinds of different directions. We don't seem to have a story that kind of binds us together again. And it leaves us in this sense of kind of lostness. So what do we do? What do we do with this post-truth kind of era where we have all these influences that make it very, very difficult to know what's true anymore? How do we navigate that? Which again is kind of the point of the whole course. Well, as one of the things that we need to do, and we've been trying to do that in this course so far, is that we have to recognize the limits of our thinking. We've been trying to communicate that through all of these classes. These are all the books, there's a whole bunch of books out there, many of which we've used, that all really get at the fact that we've learned a lot in the last generation about how our minds work. That our minds are not these pristine kind of reasoning boxes, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in our minds. Most of it goes on below the surface. Humans are basically irrational. We're not rational people, the way that some of the Enlightenment thinkers tended to kind of think, or they at least presented themselves in that way. Now, we have to recognize that there is limits to our thinkings, and this is the great insight of postmodernism, that humans have to be a little more humble about what we know. Scientists have to be a little more humble about what we know. But in spite of that, as Steven Pinker says, we have to come back to the fact that humans are a cognitive species that depends on explanations of the world. But we depend on knowledge. Knowledge may be difficult for us. It may be hard, and we've learned a lot more about the limits of our thinking in the last generation because we have cognitive science and neuroscience and all these disciplines. But that really ought to be a spur to help us do what comes naturally to us as humans, which is to seek knowledge. Pinker writes, since the world is the way it is, regardless of what people believe about it, there is a strong selection pressure for an ability to develop explanations that are true. It is adaptive for us to find out what is true as opposed to what is false. This is why people are looking for the truth all the time. It's adaptive. It helps us survive to know what is actually true as opposed to what is just kind of truthy or is just kind of ideal or what have you. And this is the main point that he's getting at in his book, Enlightenment Now, is that we have to accept the fact that we are creatures that want knowledge, and that there is a way, in fact, that we can obtain knowledge in spite of the criticisms that come up against Enlightenment kind of thinking. And this is what I call re-enlightenment. Again, it's this idea that we need to recommit to the Enlightenment formula that we get knowledge by using facts to reason and persuade ourselves and others. Just because we have problems with our thinking, just because we've made mistakes in the name of science, doesn't mean that we should just abandon it and kind of live lives of despair not knowing what's true. Actually, we need to recommit knowing the problems, knowing our history, having learned, hopefully, from our mistakes that we've made in the name of science and reason. We should recommit ourselves to the idea that it is really facts and reasoning and using evidence and persuading what have you that has made the best things that we think of in the modern world come from this kind of application. And that's the point of his book. In his book, he talks about how it is this model, this Enlightenment formula. This is why we have made the progress that we've made. This is why we are on the verge of eliminating poverty worldwide. This is why we've had something like 2 billion people have come out of poverty since the 1980s because of the application of reason and science and what have you around the world as it's spread out, particularly from the United States. So again, this is the Enlightenment formula. We get knowledge by using facts to reason with and persuade ourselves and others. This is how I would say we're going to navigate our post-truth world. It's by recommitting to this idea with the knowledge that we have about how our minds work, how we can make mistakes, what our biases are, and all these kinds of things. It ought to give us an engine to push forward in the direction of knowing what is true, not pushing away from trying to figure out what is true. Which brings us to the next section. ideas, and facts. Does anybody have a question about what I just said? We're going to talk about this later. But anybody have a question about it? Okay, good. So, that being said, how do we figure out what the facts are, right? If we're going to recommit to facts, let's get a good idea of what we mean. A good idea. Let's get a handle. Let's get a handle on what we mean by facts. And to do that, how many of you have anybody here been to the Vatican? I'm just curious. Excellent. We've got 2 people who have been to the Vatican. Well, I'm told if you go up on the 2nd floor to the papal quarters and what have you, you can go and you can see Raphael's famous painting, The School of Athens. And if you're familiar with the School of Athens, it's one of the most famous paintings in Western art history. Here you have the 2 great leaders, the great founders of Greek philosophy, because again, the Enlightenment, like Western culture in general, really has its foundations in Greek philosophy, and I should have mentioned that. But here you have Plato and Aristotle, and around them are all the great leading lights of the Greco-Roman world, all the great poets and playwrights and thinkers and philosophers and what have you, all assembled there. And Plato there and Aristotle. And what I want you to notice is something really interesting about this painting, and many people have noted this. You'll read this in several books. Is that Plato is pointing up. Aristotle is kind of pointing down. He's pointing down to the ground. Plato's like up here. Aristotle is down here. And what's interesting about this is this illustrates 2 ways, 2 modes of thinking about the world. One that is more in the Platonic tradition, and one that is more in the Aristotelian tradition. And I think this is a really important insight, and hopefully you'll see where I'm going with this. Because there are different ways of seeing reality. Different ways of seeing reality. And there's a sense in which Plato and Aristotle are 2 examples of 2 different modes of looking at reality. One is the realm of ideas, which is what Plato focused on, ideas. And the other is the realm of facts, which is what Aristotle focused on. Aristotle focused on the stuff that's down here, what we can observe. Plato, on the other hand, tended to focus on ideas, the stuff that we imagine. And I think it's an important distinction if we want to understand critical thinking. The difference between ideas and facts. An idea is an inspiration. It's intuitive kind of thinking, an idea. Think about when you get, I got an idea, right? Something that comes to you. It's something that comes to you. It's a rational, it's a reason that you have in you. I think that we ought to take this and do that. It's an idea, it's an inspiration that comes to you. And again, it's part of our imagination. It's something that we imagine in our heads. We kind of see it in our heads. Again, Plato's looking up at the sky. It's the realm of ideas in that sense. It's abstract. It's something that we abstract in our head. It doesn't have form so much. It's something that we kind of see in our minds, an idea. As opposed to a fact. A fact is an observation. A fact is something that we observe on the ground, so to speak. It's more the process of our deliberative thinking. Facts are things that we observe over time. We collect and we observe them. It is empirical. You've heard the term empirical. Well, what something is empirical is something that is observed. It's measured. We talk about, when something is an empirical question, it's something that we can measure. We can look at data and figure out if something is true or not. It's based more on evidence. It's concrete. Again, Plato, ideas tend to be up here, so to speak, as opposed to facts tend to be down here so much. And you see it in this painting. Opening up this a little bit more, and we'll get into this in our part 2 of the course in a lot more detail. And this has come down to us over the ages as two different ways of thinking. Plato is the father of what's called rationalism. It's more reason-based, it's more argument-based thinking. Aristotle is the father of what's called empiricism. It's more exploratory. It's more looking at what's on the ground, so to speak. And this is the origins of the scientific method, which is based more on evidence that you see than on simply arguments. Now, and again, there's not one bucket or the other. There's crossover between the two, but there's a basic kind of orientation. Scientists are much more concerned with evidence than they are with kind of rational arguments. Philosophers are more concerned with rational arguments. Scientists are not concerned with ideology so much, with ideas so much, as they are interested in using the scientific method to find out what's true. And on that note, what do we mean by ideology? Well, ideology is a set of conscious and unconscious ideas that frame how we understand and experience the world. Our world view, these are rational beliefs. What I mean by rational beliefs is that I can state reasons. It's not based on what I see. It's based upon what I think, how I imagine, right? How I reason about the world. Whereas science is a set of conscious and unconscious facts that frame how we understand and experience the world. It's more based on evidence, or the idea of induction. I'm not going to get into induction and deduction. We'll get into that in our next class. But you see kind of the difference between ideologies and and what science does with reference to facts. And what's critical is that ideas tend to morph into ideologies that can do a lot of damage. Think about some of the ideas that people have had about the world. Here's a great idea, not a great idea, but here's an idea, the idea that Adolf Hitler had, the fascist ideas that Hitler had. And we see that today. We have groups on either side of our divide that have these same kinds of ideas and what have you. They can do a lot of damage. And the point that I want to make is that facts hold ideas accountable. This is the role of science. This is the role of facts. This is why facts are really, really important. Ideas are good. An idea may be a hypothesis. It may be a scientific hypothesis. It may be an idea that we just have in our normal lives about, well, I think if I did this, this would happen. And I go and I test it and what have you. An idea may be very good, but it has to be tested with facts. It has to be tested by looking at the facts of things. And the point I want to make in this is that science, and particularly our way of life in America, is really geared more towards this Aristotelian idea that facts ground reality more than ideas. And that's owing to the fact that ideas can do a lot of damage if they're not kept in their right place. Which brings me to the last thing I want to talk about, and that is the scientific method. And this is why the scientific method is so important. This is why science is really, really important. And as a critical thinker, this is why facts are really, really important. Because we understand the world by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. That's what science does. Science takes facts. Facts are a way of testing the ideas that people have in the scientific process. That's what we're doing in the scientific process. It's the idea that we make a conjecture about something, and then we try and refute it. We try and falsify it. And in that process, we come to a place of knowledge. We take ideas about the world, and then we put them up against the facts of the world. We have an idea about something, and then we test it. Is this really true? Does this really work? Is this really something that's factually correct? And in that process, we get knowledge. Again, facts hold ideas accountable. It's the role that they play. And we see this in the scientific process. What scientists do, one of the things that scientists do is what's called peer review. Peer review is a process of evaluation within a given field by people of equal competence, peers, to ensure quality and credibility of the science. Again, holding ideas accountable. Somebody has an idea about how something works. Somebody has an idea about how to solve a problem. That idea has to be put to a test, and it's put to a test by bringing all the relevant facts into play. Well, how do we do that? Well, we do that by bringing lots of people together who have similar kinds of competence, who can have dialogue and interaction and what have you, to challenge the ideas to make sure that they add up to the facts. That's what peer review is about. And science, one of the pillars of science is this idea of using peer review to figure out what's true. Another thing scientists do is what's called replication, which is the repetition of a scientific experiment or trial to obtain a consistent result. It's an important part of building a body of knowledge. You have an experiment that you do and you get a certain result. Is it mean that you've discovered what's true? Well, maybe. But the way that science works is they say, well, what about another group over here? Another group over here does the same kind of experiments. Do they get the same result? If they get the same result, then you say, maybe we're getting close to the truth. You multiply that out over many different groups, this idea of replication. This is how we use facts to hold ideas accountable. We have an idea about what will solve this problem. We use peer review and replication and what have you. This is how we come to a knowledge that this is something that is true or it is not true. We build a consensus model. You hear it all the time. This is the scientific consensus, which is kind of a moving target, but that's what's going on. There's peer review going on. Different groups of people who are in the same field with the same kind of competences are testing. They're looking at all the different ideas that are out there, all the hypotheses that are being put forward. They're testing them with facts. And the result of that is that there is a better appreciation of what's going on, so that you can get to a place where you say, well, we think this is kind of true. This is something that is true. This is something we know, we have good confidence is true about the world. And what's critical in all of this is that there has to be kind of a viewpoint diversity in that mix. You have to have people who are willing to stand up with a different way of looking at the same ideas, look at the same data and what have you. We have to have people with different beliefs, different ways of seeing things in order to get this process to work to where we can all kind of come to a consensus. And of course, one of the things that gets in the way of science, we talked about my side bias a couple of weeks ago. We have this problem as humans that we have to be right all the time. We went through that a couple of weeks ago. And this is one of the problems with science, is that scientists are people too, and they have all these same kind of biases. So one of the things that you get in science, if you don't have viewpoint diversity, if you don't have peer review and replication and all these things, if there isn't an environment of disconfirmation where people are challenging one another, where facts are being used to keep ideas accountable, you can get what's called value-added science. That is institutionalized my-side bias. We know the story of the tobacco companies, right? Tobacco companies use science, right? They used peer review. They used replication and all these kinds of things to do what? To get their point of view across. That's right. We can also think of, we all know the problems with Exxon in particular with global warming in the 1990s. They just simply did not want to believe the data coming in that the Earth was warming. It's a kind of value-added science. The value here is, my profits are getting in the way of the science. So, we'll have this tendency to not look at certain facts, not entertain certain facts. You can have people manufacture science because they've got something else, driving them other than finding out what's true. And to be fair, these are kind of things that folks on the left pick on all the time. We have a real problem today we talked a little bit at the beginning, in our universities, because our universities are so left-leaning with lots of progressive activism on campus. Our psychology today has been inundated with ideas that are not really adding up to the facts. There's a lot of value-added stuff coming into our psychology today, things that are really driven by progressive ideology more than they are science. So this is a problem across the board, this problem of value-added science. So you have to be careful when you're looking at science. You have to be careful, where's it coming from? Who's the group? If you have a group of people, I don't mean to pick on them, that are called the Union of Concerned Scientists, that tells you that they're bringing a value to the mix. What's the value? Well, they're concerned. They're concerned about the environment. That's a value they're bringing to the mix. That's going to color how they see the science. In the same way that the tobacco and the oil companies, you have certain values they bring to the mix. So be careful when you're looking at science. I always say, look at who the groups are that are doing. Is this an advocacy group? It doesn't mean that their science is bad. But if they are an advocacy group, be aware that that probably is going to color their science. So we have to kind of be aware of that. And the other thing we need to be aware of is that science has real limits. And this particularly is true with people when we get to the whole question of faith and belief and religion and science. And I always like to remind people as a former pastor, faith is the evidence of things not seen, according to the Bible and according to other religious traditions. Science is the evidence of things seen. There's a sense in which faith is kind of rooted in ideas a lot more, right? And this, which is why science can often be in conflict with faith. But science, can't tell you everything. Faith is what is intuitively true within the limits of our experience. It's the realm of meaning and what have you. It's a metaphysical kind of thing. It's not something that we observe so much. Whereas science is what is demonstrably true within the limits of our thinking, facts. And there are some things that we cannot observe. We can't observe what happened prior to the Big Bang, or I think it's 20 seconds after the Big Bang, whatever it is, that we can see now when you look at the telescopes. We're never going to be able to observe whether there is something outside of our universe. We can only have ideas about it. We can't actually observe it. We can't see it. So it's kind of beyond the realm of science to talk about what might be at back of the universe. It's one of those things where you have to recognize there are limits to science, because science is the evidence of things that are seen, things that we can observe. There are things that are beyond our ability to observe. They're things that science really can't talk to. So there are limits to science, and it's really important that we understand that. Richard Feynman famously said, religion is a culture of faith. Science is a culture of doubt. Religion is, again, faith is the evidence of things not seen. It's an inner kind of conviction that you have. It's a belief that you have. Whereas science is a culture of doubt and skepticism. Show me. I want to see the data. I want to see the evidence. That's science. Religion, not so much. Religion is a sense of faith, whole soul commitment to an idea or to a person or what have you. They're two very different kinds of thing, two different kinds of culture. And as Carl Sagan famously said, science is not only compatible with spirituality, it is a profound source of spirituality. They're two different realms, but they can live side by side because they're talking to two different kinds of things. One is talking about observable reality, and the other is talking about something that is more intuitive, something that is more having to do with the source of meaning and what have you. Seems like there's a longer quote there that's missing. But so anyhow, what I wanted to share with you, this is kind of what I wanted to get at tonight, and there's a lot more we could and should say about this, but that we really need to, I would say, because of this post-truth world that we're in today, let's not shrink back from pursuing facts. Let's not shrink back from trying to understand the world and engaging in science and these kinds of things. Let's learn. Let's listen to the postmodernists and the skeptics and all these folks. Let's learn from them the mistakes that we've made. Let's understand the limits of our thinking. Let's understand the limits of science, that we can't know everything. But let's recommit to the Enlightenment formula that we get knowledge by using facts to reason and persuade ourselves and others. And again, as Pinker points out in his book, this is how we've made great progress in our world today. We've got a ways to go. But the way to move forward is not to abandon this, which folks are tending to do nowadays, but it's to reinvest in it with the knowledge that we have, with a bit of humility, because there's so much more that we can do in making the world a better place. Again, critical thinking. This is really what critical thinking is all about, the subjective analysis and evaluation designed to form good judgment. Think for yourself. Think with others. Dare to understand. But so that's what I kind of had to say about how to navigate our post-truth world. We're going to take a break, and I'll be happy to take questions I guess we could do questions in a little bit before Marla comes. If you want to talk, if you want to push back, if you've got questions or comments. There were some things that I kind of passed over too quickly, I know, but...
Oh, are you asking now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Marianne, and then David, and then Linda.
Okay.
Love the limits of science thing. I just gotten into this. I have a high school friend that likes to tease people into arguments on both sides, and she likes, that there's equal sides, but it's not really that equal. But she was going on about the transgenders and a post about a transgender having a baby, somebody male, that should not happen. He's male. He's got a Y chromosome. That's science. But I put back to her, our science is equal in caliber of a Lincoln log house and one of the high rises in Bahrain. It's just we don't have all of our stuff together. That we don't understand why people have a sense that they're more one gender than another, beside their X and Y chromosomes.
Gender dysphoria is what you're talking about.
Yes.
Right.
But we don't understand our chromosomes. We don't understand all the RNA aspects and how they impact us. The endocrine system, the hormones, we think we know, but we're still finding vitamins, for God's sakes. There's no way that we're, that smart on our hormone systems and how they impact. There's been people since the start of humans that have not felt comfortable in the bodies that they're in. It's, so it's not just somebody's decision that they, don't
It's
want
complicated.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's not, so she's hard and fast. They have a Y chromosome, so, they can't be a female. But that doesn't mean that the definition can't be fluid as we get more knowledge in our science.
Yeah, another thing we did a talk on gender and touched on transgenderism, and it's about 0.7, 0.6% of the population that identifies as transgender. So it's a very, very small number of people, and yet it's a group of people that over the centuries has received a lot of discrimination and shame. And if you've known, I've known 2 transgendered individuals, so it's something that we really have to take seriously. At the same time, though, there is this push. I mentioned the problem in the universities about psychology becoming kind of captive to activists. One of the things, having said everything about the needs to be helpful and warm-hearted and concerned and caring about transgender people, there are activists who don't represent all transgender people who kind of have ideas about gender that don't really line up with the science. And that may be where your science friend is coming from. I mean, Homo sapiens are sexually dimorphic. There are males and there are females. Gender is an expression of maleness and femaleness. That's a scientific reality. And it is true that we don't really understand gender dysphoria completely. But the concern that many people would have is we don't want to start talking about gender fluidity, as if there is this broad spectrum of genders and now broad spectrum of sexes, because that's outside of our real scientific knowledge. But we have to be accepting of the fact that we have these kind of anomalous experiences. I've got a son who's autistic. Right? We have people that have these anomalous experiences. And to me, the great wonder of today is that we can step back and appreciate them for who they are, that they're out of the norm. They're not the typical expressions of what it means to be human. But we need to be careful to not kind of erase that experience that they have, but to appreciate it and learn, and most importantly, help these people deal with the fact that they have this terrible, I would say it's the 2 that I've known, this has been a huge struggle. Being a man and yet identifying more as a woman. I think where you run into trouble is when you get well-meaning activists that will say things like, well, some women have penises. I've heard somebody say that. That begins to stretch the problem of science and ideas, because what they mean is there are men who identify as women. There are who have penises. It can be very confusing to people, particularly to children.
Hermaphrodites, and that's where I
Right.
that referred to.
Right. Right. And some of this is coming in from the activists, and again, I would say appreciate where the activists are coming from. They're trying to say, hey, don't erase these people's experience because they don't fit into the nice, neat boundaries of male and femaleness. Yet at the same time, we run the risk of undermining the science if we don't recognize that there are 2 sexes and there are kind of 2 genders, and there are these people who have an anomalous kind of experience, and that we need to be caring about how we deal with those people.
It seems, as you're saying that, it's relating to me like the people with Down syndrome. They've been normalized into society now, but I remember back as a child having someone, a neighbor, and hidden away,
Yeah.
and institutionalized in that, even though they have intelligence, they have capability,
That's right.
They're very expressive, and so it's kind of a similar.
Yeah.
To me, it's sort of a similar
Yeah.
scenario.
It is, and we need to be accepting. At the same time, again, accepting and yet not necessarily obliterate facts about biology, in order to be accepting. And there is a little bit of that that's happening in the activist circles. Huh?
We don't know the biology to the nth degree yet.
Well, we know sexual reproductive biology. And so we know that there are males and females, and what you'll get with a lot of these activist groups is they're trying to blur that line between males and females. In trying to, well-meaning, they're trying to say, don't erase these people who don't have that experience. And we don't, because we don't want to do that. At the same time, we don't want to obliterate real biological distinctions that are important. You know, and how do you find the sweet spot where we're doing, but how do you affirm transgender people without undermining science? And that can be a problem when you get ideology in the mix.
Hold on a minute. David was up, and then Linda, and then we should have a break after those.
Well, in theory, I definitely agree with what you're saying. But in the first Enlightenment, there were many fewer facts. The scope of knowledge of human beings was much less. And it was almost possible for that Renaissance man to really know most of the facts in the world.
Yeah, it's a good point.
But today, we have such an explosion of information and disinformation and groups pushing both sides. I find it really difficult to say I know a fact anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really good point.
I think physics drove a lot of the postmodern thinking, because when we started realizing that particularly light, it's a probability, not a hard.
The speed of light changes.
And so it then affected philosophy, and has now, there's a lag in that, but it's filtered into our thinking.
Yeah.
And I think it bangs up against our survival needs to have a handle on reality. So I know that, tigers bite and that I know what to do. So I think we're in a transition that's really difficult between our biology and our thinking and physics. There are facts that actually support that ideology. So how do we resolve that?
Well, I think to me, that's the next step
Evolution.
in the discussion. But
In your discussion.
Right, and I think that it doesn't mean that we do away with the scientific method, or we do away with the pursuit of knowledge and facts. But we've got to recognize that the postmodernists had a point.
Yes.
And we have to be humble about it, and we really have to have viewpoint diversity and a lot more humility about what we know than maybe they had 200 years ago, when much more could be known.
I mean, the way that I try to navigate is to have working hypotheses. This is what I know for now. I just read a few days ago a paper about the depression thing, where they had all linked depression to genes, and they're finding out it was all wrong. And it's like they talked about 10 years and I don't know how much money thrown away, but how do we, there has to be trial and error too, but can we get smarter about it? And it is confusing. I don't think there's an answer of how to navigate except to try to hold those two things, like to value some facts and to value also the skepticism but not go crazy. It's hard. Linda, you had
Do you want to move on to the break?
Um,
For your timing?
Well, let's see.
Why don't we take a few more questions? And
Or if,
Or
take a few
comments?
more questions.
Well,
But
you're gonna take more than
Go
I
ahead,
would
go
like
ahead,
to be
yeah.
next.
Go ahead. Yeah. You go ahead.
Thank you. I think for me the word truth is problematic. And I really like your distinction about Aristotle and Plato and ideas and beliefs. And I like the word meaning. And I like the word fact. Those work for me. Seeable, provable, you can do scientific experiments and get the same thing time after time. But truth, if you use the word truth to mean factual, then what about truth? It just resonates for me. It's the truth. I believe that. That is a problem for me. So I'm really happy that you came up with two better words, facts and meaning.
Well, I would say truth is kind of provisional, but a good scientist will say For example, there are some things that there may be 80% confidence that this is true because we've got a lot of data, we've got a lot of experience. There may be some things, a good example is gravity versus anthropogenic global warming. The greenhouse effect has only been around for 120, 130 years. We don't know as much about the greenhouse effect as we do about, say, gravity. So you could say both of those are factually based, but it's not like they're a parity.
But the science facts change as we learn new information.
Right.
So, and maybe so do the ideologies.
Yeah.
But in different ways.
Well, good. I'm glad
At
you're.
least for me, different ways.
Yeah. I personally, I find that Aristotle, Plato, and I didn't mention it, but this book, The Cave and the Light, which won the Pulitzer Prize, I just finished this about a month ago, lays this all out, and it's like, this whole image, and you need both. You need ideas and vision, you need that. But again, there's this kind of check. Let's make sure that it adds, let's do the math. Right? Let's make sure that our ideas are kind of conforming to what we kind of know is true about the world, even though we don't know it perfectly. We don't have like truth. The way that 500 years ago, Martin Luther thought he had truth. Well, that's a kind of a nebulous concept now.
Okay, Alice, you had your hand up.
Well, his point was, he made my point.
Oh.
But also he had something that made me chuckle. I saw, I don't know how many of you have seen Sherlock. It's playing here at the local theater, Cabaret. It's The Sign of the Four, and I just lost this just a second. There's a line in it. Sherlock Holmes is written when Arthur Conan Doyle, whenever he wrote it. But there's a line in there where Watson is just so taken with how Sherlock Holmes figures this out through what?
Deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning, right.
And so the line is, and I was so taken by it because of our discussions here, I had to go Google it and wrote it down, but here it is. This is Sherlock speaking. When you have eliminated the impossible, and whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Oh, interesting.
So it's just very interesting, I think, from that, how he got to his truth always through
Deductive reasoning.
Through the deductive,
Right.
yeah.
And both are important.
Yeah, but it was just,
But
from that
Sherlock
time, and it
used
reflects the
deductive
times
reasoning.
But then
too.
how
He
did
did-
he
oh,
know
he-
you've eliminated?
Oh, he did. That's
Exactly.
true. He looked at all the
Yes.
facts and
He-
reasoned up from the facts,
And you
not
see that-
deductive reasoning.
Yeah,
Is that
and you see that
helpful?
in the play where he's taking everything out and he comes to this, and no one can, how did you get to this place? And so he has this great broad statement about it. I thought it was kind of relevant here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Glad you're doing your extra credit.
Yeah. It carries out. It carries
You'll
out.
have to send me that quote.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jeff, did you have your hand up?
Email, I guess.
Yes. Yeah.
Geometry.
Go ahead.
Well, can you go back a couple of slides? Keep going. There we go. I'm not sure how much I agree with what you said about science. Maybe instead of seen, I might use the word measured or theorized or hypothesized. And facts as something that works for today but may not work for tomorrow. So scientific racism, phrenology, the notion that well, we know what gender is. Well, it's changed now and maybe different in 10 years. Depression is a gene expression. Maybe that'll change in 10 years. You know, you were talking about how we can't see past the Big Bang. We can't with our current understanding. Maybe our understanding will change in the future. Who knows? And I think also with faith, I'm certainly not a pastor and never been a great scriptorian, but my understanding is that, at least within Christianity and certainly within Islam as well, the idea of what the Bible means has changed in the last 2,000 years. If we were to drop in with our time machine into the 14th century versus the 17th century or the 19th century and sit down with a man or woman of God, they might have a very different understanding, yet it's the same text. So I think all of this is a bit amorphous. It feels a bit like a fractal, where you see a general shape, but as you get closer, it becomes more and more and more and more increasingly complex. But if you zoom out, there's a shape. If you zoom in, the shape seems to change.
Well, that's like even with physics, the difference between relativity and quantum. You get these two. Relativity describes the big things, right? The big picture. But when you focus in on the little things, you get a different. So there's some ambiguity in there. Yet I would say at the same time, I think there are reasonable distinctions between the two.
I would agree, yeah.
But they're not absolute
No.
distinctions. And science is a bit of a moving target.
I think faith is as well. I think faith is informed by whatever the humanist philosophy is of the day and of the people that are looking at it.
Well, it's intuitive.
Yeah, faith is individual. Faith is very individual, and all of this it's through a filter of a very limited mind.
Yes, yes, and again, I think that's the point we were trying to make with all the, the books and is that it's coming through a filtered, we don't see reality, we're creating, our brains kind of create reality for us. Yet when we put all that together, when we compare and we analyze as a group, we get closer to what is more objectively true, because we can kind of winnow out those things that are just really the product of our own distortions. So I think we have to be careful of kind of falling into a kind of a skepticism about knowing. On the other hand, falling into a kind of this kind of hegemonic, we know the truth, kind of absolutism, which can be equally dangerous. Because again, as Pinker said, we do have this this adaptive need to know what's true in the world. We do have a need to be able to find real answers that align with what is real and what is true. It just may be difficult to find those answers, in here and there.
And maybe one of the conclusions is, can we just, especially thinking of the political divide, do we have to hold on so strongly to what we think is true, or even if it's my truth in a subjective way? I mean, that's what I've listened to this talk a bunch of times, right, already, but it's like, can I hold all of this more lightly in a way, where many things are true at once, even though they seem paradoxical? And how much do I need to have the feeling of knowing, like you were saying, tied up with my biology? How can I be more flexible?
We learn to tolerate not knowing.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
Well, and that's what Feynman and other more recent scientists are saying, truth's kind of provisional. We kind of have to, we don't want to
he's a great one for that.
Yeah, totally.
I'm getting nervous about my time because I have about a half an hour. I want my time. So take a 5-minute break.
I'm going to set the little timer.
Set the timer, and then,
How about for 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5 is good. Thank you. The part I'm going to cover is learning to think when it comes to media and social media. And the first point I want to cover is something that Catherine Schultz does a really good job with in her book, Being Wrong. And she talks about that there's two definitions of right and wrong, right? There's the right and wrong about facts and accuracy and correctness, and there's right and wrong morally and ethically, right? So what she talks about is that it's very dangerous when those two definitions get overlapped and laminated, because what happens is, if I take a strong moral stance and maybe have moral outrage about something where I've gotten the facts wrong, and in light of what Rob is saying and what we know with the fake news and in being in our echo chambers where we're only getting the point of view we already have, I know one thing that I've learned is that a lot of the opinions I had were based on something I read 20 years ago, and I never gave myself the upgrade, right? So she says intellectual errors enable moral wrongs, and in her book she gives a lot of historical evidence and stories, and this is really, really dangerous right now, because with the heightened outrage and the inability, like you were saying, Linda, it's people's responsibility to inform themselves. It's not happening. Whether it should be or isn't, it's not happening. So what I'm asking you is that when you're on social media, even if you're talking to friends, remember some of the things we've learned in this class. Our confirmation biases, our triggering, our reactivity, our tribalism, all the ways our mind plays tricks on us. And now this idea that we could be making a moral stance based on not knowing the whole story, for example. There's a clip that I want to show that really addresses this. It's called Why Our Brains Love Fake News. But what my hope is that you come out of this class with is these recognitions of the different things we've talked about. And some of the things that I ask myself when I'm involved with sharing news, either online or in life. Can I recognize that I'm in an echo chamber? Am I reading an article which is only one-sided? Have I fact-checked? Do I know what I'm sharing is true? Am I passing on information I'm not sure about? Am I cherry-picking my facts? And then there's something that I have been guilty of in the past, and that's called virtue signaling. Does anybody know what that is, virtue signaling? It's defined as publicly expressing opinions or feelings intended to demonstrate one's good character or moral correctness, and identifies you as a member of your tribe to show your group affiliation. And what's so interesting is that when we go back to have what we talked about in the first or second class about the need to belong, is so wired, and the anxiety can be so devastating when we dare to speak a different voice. One kind of funny example of virtue signaling is I've had a Prius for like 13 years, and when I got it, my kids called it a pious. I was signaling to my tribe that I was green and, all about the environment and groovy. And it is a good car anyway, but. The other thing, the inverse of that is, am I not sharing a point of view because I'm afraid of being ostracized or attacked? So the problem that we covered at the beginning about us versus them is within sides as well. And I know that, I started out more on the left than I am now. I'm more centrist or I don't knowist, but I would get pushback from people who were further left than me. So it's like you're 100% for us or you're against us kind of thing. So there's that to me is a lot of groupthink, a lot of this infighting that we are seeing on the left, I think on the right too. The other point I want to make is a bigger one, especially on social media. And we did a whole piece about this on Brene Brown's book, Braving the Wilderness, which was really about bridging the divide. And she talked about how we've dehumanized and that we need to rehumanize. So one of the things she talked about is this double standard. She said, if you are offended or hurt when you hear Hillary Clinton called bitch or a whore or something else, I'm not going to say, you should be equally offended and hurt when you hear those same words used to describe Ivanka Trump or Kellyanne Conway. If you felt belittled when Hillary Clinton called some Trump supporters a basket of deplorables, then you should have felt equally concerned when Eric Trump said Democrats aren't even human. One example we found is when Kathy Griffin used the decapitated bloody head of Trump. If you're offended at that, then you shouldn't have an effigy of Obama being lynched on your Facebook feed. So when we hear people referred to as animals, instincts, or something disgusting, we should immediately wonder, is that an attempt to reduce someone's humanity so we can get away with hurting them or denying them basic human rights, and therefore thereby morally excluding them? It happens all the time on social media. Now the story I want to bring into tonight is that when we did that same presentation last year in Bend at the UU up there, the first person to raise her hand when we opened up the discussion worked at the UU, and she had tears in her eyes, and she said, I have a confession to make. She said, I've called those women those names, and I will never do it again. She was thinking about what she was doing, because part of thinking is metacognition and realizing about our morality. right? And if we somehow feel self-righteous and justified about treating people a certain way, we're really not thinking. So that was like, that was an I can die happy moment when that happened. That's why I'm doing the work that I do. Brene says, there is a line, it's etched from dignity, and raging, fearful people from the right and left are crossing it every day. We must never tolerate dehumanization. When we engage in dehumanizing rhetoric or promote dehumanizing images, we diminish our own humanity in the process. So think about what you're doing before you do it. Again, whether it's in a conversation or online, are we spreading hatred? Are we spreading unity? And we've seen all the ways our mind gets in the way of this, either by our animal instincts or our cognitive biases. The other point I want to make about media today, there's a woman named Amanda Ripley who wrote a great article in The Atlantic maybe last year, and it was called Complicating the Narrative. And she's working really hard to have a different form of journalism. So right now you have a lot of journalists, so-called journalists, giving one side of the story. You have some journalists giving both sides, but she said where they're really successful in getting people to think differently is when they give both sides of the story, but then they show how complex things are and how not black and white and how this side impacts that side and really titrates and zooms out to give us a bigger picture. And I think we can do that for ourselves as well. Whatever we're taught, even if I'm trying to understand David, right? I can zoom out, I can see the complexity, and if we have different points of view, I can see the complexity between us and what he has valid to say and what I have valid to say. So she does this very nice clip. Again, she's talking about journalism, but I think it applies to all of us.
22 years. After the 2016 election, I really felt like, I had sort of not understood what millions of Americans were thinking and feeling and perceiving about the media, and that felt like a failure. And so I really wanted to take a step back and try to think about, is there something that we could do differently? Lawyers. We've
had problems with this video before.
So I've been a journalist for about 20 months, hanging out with people who understand conflict differently. Conflict mediators, psychologists, lawyers, rabbis. And what I found is that they have this whole book of tricks that most journalists never learn that are healthier and more interesting, actually, than the ways that most journalists cover conflict. We usually cut the details that don't fit our plot line. So instead, very intentionally raising those up and not cutting them, but showing that people are complicated, like no person is one thing. Instead of doing yet another story about a debate over the border wall, do a story about how this community has handled the border for the past 200 years. Widen the lens so it becomes an inquiry again instead of just two sides yelling at each other. What brought you to this? Why is this important to you? What do you wish that the other side understood about you? And what do you want to understand about the other side? So it's like truly more interesting to ask questions like this than to just, what's your position? What are you going to do about it? How much do you hate the people who disagree with you, right? Take what you think the most important thing to them was and play it back to them in the most concise, articulate way you can. And what happens are two important things. First, they correct you if you got something a little wrong, which happens more often than most journalists think. And secondly, when you do this, people feel heard. And this magical thing happens with humans. Like when they feel heard, they will open up to you more. They will even hear information that conflicts with their deeply held beliefs. We know that the only way to reduce prejudice in every civilization ever is have people interact in meaningful ways on equal footing across division. That's the role of journalists, is to help the other side understand each other. And so this is an important and difficult thing to do, particularly when things get polarized, but it is just essential that we do it with a spirit of inquiry. Be very thoughtful and about how we counter confirmation bias. So this is the tendency of people, which we all have, to reject things that don't fit our pre-existing beliefs and narratives.
So, and also not to, firstly, to take this on, to apply it to our own lives, but when you're reading an article, is the journalist using some of these things, or can you see through it? And it's really tricky, because if you already believe what they're saying, chances are it's hard to say, oh, well, is there bias here? Because it feels like it's right. It feels truthy. The other thing I want to point out is something, some of you might know the author Charles Eisenstein. He's big in the gift economy and different things. He had a really great blog about online business after the election. And he was really against online hatred. He's very against hatred. Next time you post online, check your words to see if they smuggle in some form of hate, dehumanization, snark, belittling, derision, some invitation to us versus them. Notice how it feels kind of good to do that, like getting a fix, like the dopamine rush he was talking about. Alan Jacobs, who we've quoted before, his book, How to Think, he talks about using calm, good sense versus a race to the bottom of the brainstem. So we have to, again, like we've been talking about all this month, you know, pause, think about, have metacognition, think about what you're doing or feeling. And he said, this is what happens. We race to the bottom of the brainstem when we push send, either literally or metaphorically. So we each have a personal responsibility. That's why even like news sources, when they take back a story, oh, we got it wrong, the feathers are already out there. It really doesn't matter. So I hope that some of these tools and some of the things we've talked about will just make us more aware of our interactions. And so now it's open for, we got 15 minutes for discussion or Q&A. Or so one thing you might want to do, you might want to take the opportunity, is when I've been a participant in a class or a workshop, it's often useful to anchor any new insights that you might have had out loud, and you have the opportunity to do that as well tonight. Don't make me call names.
Every
time I see that, it really, yeah, the clip.
It's
Very powerful.
Well, and it reinforces what you were saying to me about when we talk about ideas and facts. There's that gray, you know, that you have to recognize. Mm-hmm. A little bit of doubt has to be in the equation. Right. It humbles us, keeps us from being puffed up and filled up with what we think we know about the world.
Mm-hmm. To remember we don't know.
Right.
Everything.
Yeah, like the Catherine Schultz thing. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
The interesting thing when I show this movie in classes, this is prior to even doing the bridging work, but I would, because you really, it's so cleverly written that you can't tell if he's guilty or not. But the writer was so smart because we have a natural bias to think the priest is guilty. He's a Catholic priest, of course he molested the kid. So what happened is, right after the film, I say, okay, who thinks the priest is guilty? Who thinks he's innocent? Had a show of hands. Then we had a discussion, and then I took the vote again. And most people switched over to at least not knowing. Like if he was in a court of law where you have to be a reasonable doubt. So it was really interesting to actually see how people's mind could change through a half an hour discussion. What I did is it was a weekend workshop, so the night before I showed 12 Angry Men, where people were really dissecting, the facts and what can we know or what's inference or assumptions. So I said, if we applied what we learned in 12 Angry Men to the priest, like how would that look? Yeah, Marianne.
My aha, the quote from Brene Brown about dehumanizing. I was thinking, my friend that likes to stir things up and admittedly likes to, I'll ask her if she'd be willing to post that as a guideline.
Oh, great. Yeah, and if you want to read her section in the book, it's really excellent to flesh it even more out about dehumanization. Oh, yeah. Thank you.
We're seeing it it's so blatant in our politics.
Both sides. That's
I watched a hearing last night, and it was, to me, a congressional hearing, and it was so sad to the demonization of others. Just the default, you're a wicked person because you're doing X. This is your, this is what you want to do, that kind of a thing. And again, both sides do this.
yes.
Well, my big takeaway from all this is it's a lot. It's kind of overwhelming. We have our lives, we need to do to survive and take care of our houses and kids or whatever.
Yeah.
And then where is the time to really dig in and find the facts, get the facts? How do you navigate? I mean, we're in such a complex world that it seems like I have a sense of overwhelm. It's like, I don't even know where to start. I'm just going to keep my mouth shut.
Well, but also the thing for what I went, and I still don't know, like if people ask me what I think about the issues, mostly I say I don't know.
Yeah.
But I even think instead of in the past having to bluff or just have an opinion that was my side's, I think it's a big improvement to say I haven't researched that, or I find it really confusing, or
We have this screen that we don't have it for this talk. We have a screen called Tips for Talking, and the last one at the bottom is
listen to the other person.
The person talking may know something that you don't.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're in that position, it's like, oh wow, well that means that when I am talking with people, it's an opportunity to learn something from somebody. Because most people actually know some things. They maybe don't know a lot, but I think you can learn something from somebody else most of the time and be cognizant that this is an opportunity to take in information and analyze it.
Right, but how do you know with that person, that they have done their research and what they're saying is true? And I'm kind of gullible. I'm talking to someone, okay, I believe most people when they tell me something. Unless I have reason not to.
Well, and again, this is why, moving into the part 2, these are kind of foundations. Now we really would have to look at, let's look at how you look at data, for example. Somebody makes a claim. Marla made a claim the other day, and we had some back and forth on it. And I said, we should probably look at that claim in more detail. And how do you do that? How do you look at a study or a meta study that has lots of different studies? How do you apply logic to what somebody is saying? What is the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning? These, how do you recognize what is a good argument, what's sound, from what is an unsound kind of argument? So those are more the practical kinds of tools that would come to play that might help.
But also, don't drive yourself crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really the takeaway. Is like I think in here one of the weeks I said, I don't even want to know about China. I'm not even gonna start there. So you can kind of pick the salient things too.
Right.
But yeah.
I just want to acknowledge how difficult that is, because I was raised in the scientific method and research and all that stuff, and have been in research, so I can dig into a study and I can look at the methodology and I can have some idea of whether it's, I can tentatively, trust the data or not, trust the interpretation of the data, because it's always an interpretation of the data. and if they've included all the data. But as you're saying, I just happen to know that.
Right.
And most people don't. And so you see a scientific study and here are the results of this. And what are you going to do? It's, even if you go and look at the abstract, you can't tell from that. You have to dig into the body of the work. And it's I think, an overwhelming thing. And so many people have bought and paid for research, agenda-based research, that it's very difficult to tell.
Right. And then, like the depression study, then even though they've done this, scientific method, it's like, oh, well, that was wrong. It's like,
and probably because they made some assumptions, they made some correlations that weren't well founded.
Right.
Right.
And it's
Causation and correlation.
Exactly.
Right. Those are the kinds of things that you would have to. Yeah.
Yes.
One thing that would really help, and is if we had better media resources than we do today.
Yeah.
I think, to me, that is one of the biggest problems. Is even the science journals have become filled with ideology today, and it's a big problem. The psychological research especially is really, it's been infected with a lot of activism, people who have a political agenda, who are forcing the science to say things that it really doesn't say.
And private funding.
Yep. Yes. Yeah, that's a real this is termed junk science.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's hard.
I've lost my faith in it. I have to be really skeptical of it now.
Yeah.
Robin.
I think the proliferation of media too, 40, 50 years ago, when everybody got their news from like 3, 4, maybe if the PBS was local, television stations, there was the fairness doctrine because the airwaves were considered commons and owned by the people, so the broadcasters had to broadcast the opposing statement. With cable and all these news channels, there is no fairness doctrine anymore, and there's just so much news. How do you...
Yeah, the talk we did on media bias, not here, we got into the fairness doctrine and how that got, what happened with that. Of course, there were problems with the fairness doctrine, because what tended to happen was because the media has always kind of leaned more to the left, folks on the right felt like the fairness doctrine was getting in the way of them being able to present their point of view. And then you had religious broadcasters who said, wait a second, I want to preach the gospel. I don't want to have an imam on with me while I talk about Jesus. So,
or a Satan worshiper.
That's right. But, it's a really good point, is that now it's like we have this kind of free-for-all with the media, and our media now, because it is profit-oriented so much, which wasn't the case in the 60s and into the 70s. I think it was 60 Minutes that the executives in the news media said, wait a second, we can make money on news? And so now it's really profit-driven, which means the more outrage that you get people, the more fear, the more you create news, the more you get people to tune in, and that has really undermined any kind of objectivity in the media space.
Yeah, Jeff.
I feel like, in some regards, we've just gone through a 4-week crash course in how to be a black belt in thinking. I love this last little piece because you've, in a sense, taught us what we need to be able to totally dismantle and deconstruct anybody whose viewpoint we disagree with. Well, that's just confirmation bias. Yeah, you just cherry pick the facts. You've done a lovely job at the end, I think, of kind of saying,
arm now.
Be kind.
Thank
you. Now that you know this, understand your own biases and gently help others to explore theirs, and in so doing, if we can be kinder to each other and more open, then we can move towards that more intimate dialogue.
Okay, I can die happy now. Thank you.
Yeah, that really
That's a great
is.
infomercial too.
And that's when we do our talks on the divide, it's like we really have to get to that space. Love your enemies. Let's get to because then we can begin to have a real conversation about stuff.
Yeah.
Whose bumper sticker is it that says vote Democrat and hug a Republican or something?
Nice. Love that. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what we need. Yeah.
There's a guy back east, his name's Billy Park, and he's started an organization called Hug It Out America, and he's made a lawn sign that says, Republicans are people too. And by the way, I'm a Democrat, but he's in the bluest county in the U.S. People come, he has it in their plaza, you know, he has a table at the plaza. And he says people come up and spit on his sign and yell at him. Yeah.
And that makes me wonder, what if we saw a sign driving around Ashland that said, vote Republican, but hug a Democrat?
You want to do a
Kind of
little
flips the
test?
sign. Yeah. Why don't we all put that on our thing?
Well, you know, we've talked about doing a poster. There is a poster that you see around very progressive Ashland that talks about loving all the groups that have been historically marginalized.
Right.
We sort of feel like that's good. Let's hold on to that. But let's hug a policeman,
Flip side.
Right.
hug a veteran, hug a firefighter, hug the
a
people,
Republican.
hug a white male.
Right? White males need love too.
White males, Republicans, you know, and again, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
You know.
Yes.
True inclusion is what we're looking
Truly,
at.
yes,
True inclusion.
Yes, really. If we're going to say it for, we also have to. That's
That's-
what this whole course really is telling us, I think. Yeah.
Oh, I hope
Good.
so.
Yeah.
Good.
Yes.
Well, we're at
What would
we're
Joe
at,
Biden say to that?
Well, and that's an interesting thing because
go ahead.
Joe Biden, I was just thinking about that earlier. You know, he was accused of touching women in an inappropriate way,
and smelling
which
their
for
hair.
him he felt was natural. I think.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my opinion.
Yeah, that's
That I don't. But then also Trump, of course, has bragged about those things. But yet all of it becomes gossip. And I feel like whenever I watch anything on one or the other side of the media, I've said this sounds like gossip. At the biggest, largest way it can be is. And what do we do?
we try to educate ourselves. I mean, I look at the whole movement of bridging. It's a psycho-spiritual movement. And it expands us as people to be able to hold a bigger, to zoom more way out than we've been able to before. And really
Widen
hold,
the lenses.
yeah, and be kind. Be
Yeah.
kind. Try to be kind. And some people say, you know, try to love. And I say, well, let's start with non-hate.
Or
That's kind of-
warm-heartedness.
Or warm-heartedness, but,
You know, try and be warm-hearted as best you can.
yeah.
There's a thing too about talking to strangers. You know, finding a stranger and starting a conversation. It's hard for some people. It's not hard for other people.
Yeah.
But wherever you are in that spectrum, to maybe challenge yourself to speak to a stranger without politics, without anything, knowing
Right.
nothing about that person except their humanity,
Right.
connecting,
Yeah, it's beautiful.
and make a better world, probably.
Got one more and we're at time.
Oh,
And then a request.
Oh, yeah.
I spent a number of years as a vice principal, and I was given a great gift as I went into that field, which was a question that a very wise person taught me. He said, ask, help me understand. And I found that was the greatest tool I ever had as a vice principal. I'd have students come in upset and angry and in trouble or whatever, and I would simply say, I wouldn't judge, I'd simply say, help me understand why this happened.
That's beautiful.
It's a great thing,
And
yeah.
the stories that would flow out were amazing, and often not at all what I expected. So I'm thinking I might brush that off
That's a good one.
relative to this, and just when I sit down with somebody who I disagree with, say, help me understand why you feel that way, or
Yes.
why you would say that thing, or
Help me understand why you voted for,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
you know, just want to understand.
Yeah.
help me understand.
Oh, I like that a lot.
yeah, that's good.
We could steal a couple.
Yeah.
Especially
It was a gift to me. I freely give it to you.
Thank you.
We
Is that
received-
Gift that keeps
high school
giving.
age or what
Yes.
age?
Middle school.
Middle school. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's those kids really need help
There.
being understood. Yeah.
And Lori, you had,
A request. You have a graphic of the breakdown that you developed of the media, and
Mhm.
which
Yes.
are on the left, which are on the right. I would love to have that available at the website. Maybe it is, and I don't know where it is.
Yeah,
But
yeah, and some of the,
something that can really help us sort. We have guidelines.
yeah, and I should say, you know, sometime we do a whole talk on what we call we look at we call the psychology of political differences, where we look at personality. I think we touched on it briefly, and moral intuitions, because that has a lot to do with how you would figure out who people are. It's not even so much what the issues are, so much it's who are the people in these organizations and how do they see the world. What have you?
That was
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
Amygdala size.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are real differences between people who are conservative and people who are more progressive. And
People
yeah,
who don't agree with me have smaller brains? Is that
The amygdala,
oh, okay, is it not?
just the amygdala.
well, if you have an overactive, like I have an overactive, if you have an overactive amygdala, you may be more conservative. You may be more phobic, fearful, in that sense, because conservatives do tend to have a little bit more of a fear for change.
For
to some
change,
extent.
I think it's important to
Yeah,
say that.
and they like what's called cognitive closure. They like lines. This is why conservatives like debate and progressives tend to like dialogue and conversations. Just are very open and what have you. So there are some very real differences. Yeah.
How does one know one has an overactive amygdala? You said you
Anxiety.
You just
Hi-
I mean, you haven't done a brain
Your
study, but you
reactions
know
and-
it.
Well, I'm an introvert for one thing, and most introverts have a higher activity in their amygdala because that's why they need to shut down all that input. There's a great book by Susan Cain called Quiet, The Quiet
Oh,
Machine.
yes.
She gets into some of the science on that, which I found really, really helpful in that regard.
So symptomatically.
I think it's called The Quiet.
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 Just quiet, yeah.
Yeah, it was one of them, for me personally, it was
Yeah.
really helpful because I've been an introvert my whole life, and she really helped to explain it from the perspective of neuroscience too.
All right.
Thank you so much. This has been one of the best groups of people.